Hi, everybody, and welcome to Inspired Live today on Monday, the 30th of June. We're super excited to welcome you all to our LinkedIn Live event today, Take Pride in Impact, where we, on the last day of June, also known as Pride Month, we listen, learn, grow, and celebrate all things Pride in publishing. In this session today, we're going to be talking to our wonderful panelists about their lived experience, positive changes they've seen in publishing, and their general insight on how, as individuals, we can make more positive impact for our colleagues. So we look today to shine a spotlight on diversity and inclusion in publishing during this event. We've created an opportunity here for us all to recognise our differences, and by doing that, it's going to make us stronger. When we create environments where our colleagues, our friends, and people can bring their whole selves to work, we get access to increased happiness, innovation, creative, and increase our potential. So this is the place you need to be on this sunny Monday. So welcome along. What I would say, the key message I sort of want to be bringing to you today is to always be you. You really do matter. Your story matters, and you make our workplaces and worlds better. So today, I'm excited to be hosting this panel alongside my wonderful panelists, who I'll introduce just in a moment. But just before I do introduce them, we always want these events to be as helpful as possible to our audience. And whilst we put, sort of ideal questions together, we'd also say, please do ask questions that you want to know the answers to. So there is a comments box, which you can add your questions in as we go along, and I'll do my best to ask them for you. Just in case there's lots and lots coming through, I will do my best. But without further ado, let me introduce my wonderful panel. Andrew James, first of all, he's worked in publishing for over 15 years and is currently publishing director at Facet Publishing. He's also the founder of the Frog Literary Agency, a literary agency dedicated to solely representing the LGBTQIA plus writers, and was previously co-chair of the Hachette Pride Employee Network. So welcome, Andrew, sorry. That's my first mistake. Sorry, Andrew. And then Hamza. Welcome, Hamza. He's a
Hello.
publishing consultant and leading voice in criticism. He's the founder and CEO of Hamza Jahanzeb. .co.uk, where he reviews theatre and comments on the publishing industry, most recently on the threat and uses of AI in business. Hamza's lived in Beijing, Prague and London, possessing a rolodex of over 1,000 publishing sensitivity readers, built over a near decade experience, whose work creates better books for clients. There's so much more about Hamza, but I'm going to let him bring that all in, and Andrew, of course. But without further ado, I think we should jump into the questions for today. So a question to you both to start with, and Andrew, if you'd like to go first. Simply, what does pride mean to you?
Well, I was thinking about Pride Month, so it's a bit more focused, and it's actually I actually found this really difficult to answer, because I feel really quite conflicted emotions around Pride Month, which I imagine lots of queer people do, really, because on the one hand, it does sometimes feel slightly like performative. It's about making maybe queer lives kind of palatable, and there's just a certain side to it that's very kind of like glittery and very like great, like celebratory, but sometimes it doesn't maybe quite capture the kind of realities or the kind of issues that we're sort of going through. Even though I think it's brilliant for raising awareness, it really helps, increase understanding, and it's really providing a lot of opportunities. I think they're all fantastic. You definitely cannot deny that. I suppose I always think about what next, what's actually going to happen. Like tomorrow morning when someone wakes up, are they going to educate themselves still? Are they going to continue to like engage with issues and understand our history? if there's that kind of person in the boardroom who feels like they, something's happened and they don't feel comfortable, are you going to stand up for that person? Is that going to happen on July 1st, or is it all just kind of going to be forgotten about? So I suppose Pride Month and Pride, it's almost like each time it's almost like a beginning to start afresh, I suppose, for people to kind of stand up and make a difference, rather than it to just be another sort of kind of celebration that sort of kind of gets forgotten about.
Hamza, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, a bit like Andrew, actually. I'd say that my idea of pride in publishing is one where we can be free to be ourselves at work. And that means not having to think about, how awkward it would be to have to perhaps use a bathroom because of a certain ruling in this country, which has now made it more difficult for us to be ourselves, whether or not people are thinking that you are some sort of quote unquote bogeyman, as gay men were once portrayed in the 90s. Pride means allowing yourselves to express yourself as you best want to. And I think more recently, and it's a bit like Andrew, it's quite sad to see there's been quite a rise in the way in which people are being targeted, and the LGBTQIA community, the queer community, as I like to refer to it. I do think Pride once was about, making sure that we are present and visible, but actually this year, and in fact in more recent years, I'd say it's more about the pride of resistance, because we have always been here. We have always had a chance to live, to thrive, and the people that want to curtail our freedoms are those who want to perhaps antagonize us, and that might be happening outside of this country as well. But what I will say is this pride means a resistance. It's very much at the crux of how we see ourselves in the future. And as Andrew said, making it tomorrow and tonight. The first, what does that mean? For some people, pride is simply a veneer of the commercialization of capitalism and slapping a rainbow on something. However, for me, I'm thinking about my queer siblings around the world in places that are currently being razed to rubble by a destructive force, by which, we're having an indirect contribution to through our sort of, political leaders. And I think pride for me is about standing up for what it means to be yourself and to allow people to live. That's what pride means for me in 2025.
Absolutely. That's fantastic. Thank you. Andrew, coming back to you, what policies have you seen that can be adapted no matter what budget or scale that you're operating at? Because we'll have a lot of people coming from SMEs or individuals maybe that don't have that support, but we want to empower and encourage individuals to stand up, like you're saying there, to make a positive impact on building that inclusive culture on the 1st of July and beyond, not just in June. So what can we potentially, as individuals or smaller organisations, with doesn't matter on the budget?
So I thought just some really simple ones were just really to do around language. It's quite basic, putting pronouns and signatures. I think a lot of people already do that, but I think it is important. Maybe people don't really understand the importance of it, but I think it's kind of like, it just helps prevent misgendering people. It helps people not feel exposed. If everyone's pronouns are out there, they don't look like the one person who's doing it, which then creates a kind of big thing around it. I just think it helps normalize those kinds of conversations. And then just in general, across like documentation and policies within your company, ensuring a lot of book contracts have his as the main pronoun throughout, that can just be changed to a kind of gender neutral one. Yeah. As well as just making sure that all staff policies are like LGBTQ plus inclusive. There's been a lot of policies around like parenting, there's been menstruation policies and kind of menopausal policies coming into place. How can we make sure that they're fully inclusive? Even looking at things like travel, you can't, there's a lot of staff, especially in sales teams, who travel around the world. They're going to countries that aren't necessarily inclusive. Have you thought about those people? Should you be allowing those people to go to those countries? Have you kind of spoken to them? I think that's a really important thing that does often get forgotten about. Yeah. There's things like having like just menstrual products in men's toilets. That's like a really simple thing to do. LGBT networks, I know a lot of the big publishers have those. Some, obviously, for an independent publisher, you might not have that. But how can you engage with those networks? Some of them hold kind of events that are for all publishers. Can you attend those? I think it's really important to have an objective, safe space to go to. When I was at Hachette, we had staff members coming to us with queries and questions which they didn't go to their managers with. They didn't feel like that was the person they could go to, so they came to the kind of employee network. So I do think that's important that they kind of exist.
Yeah.
Some other more specific things. When I worked at Jessica Kingsley Publishers, we actually developed some gender identity and sexuality inclusive guidelines for production teams and for copy editors and proofreaders. I think that's actually that's a really savvy thing to do, because sometimes copy editors might not have come into contact with certain types of lives and experiences, and it's almost like you have to kind of re-educate certain people, or they might not quite understand why a book is written in a certain way, or why an author's decided to use pronouns in this particular way. So I think that's quite important. Sensitivity reads, I know there's always been loads of conversations around that. I do think they are important, especially if the author isn't of the identity that they're kind of talking about. Just, it's not kind of trying to catch anyone out. That's definitely not the point of them. It really is just about strengthening that book. I've read a book that was written by a straight white woman, and it had a dating app, Grindr, and they were swiping. You don't do that on that dating app, but they maybe probably didn't realize that. See, this is this tiny little thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's just kind of important. So I think, they don't need to be really big things that you're doing. I would say the other thing is just, it really is simple. It's just standing up for someone. If something happens, I think you should stand up to the person who says it if you don't think it's right. Not necessarily confrontationally in the boardroom, but it could be outside. I think that's really important, and shows that you are a true ally, rather than just letting things kind of go under the radar. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's super helpful. And Hamza, I'll come to you next. Could you tell us about some of the advice you give to boards about how to improve accessibility schemes? And today we'd be really interested to hear this in relation to the LGBTQ+ community.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think what I feel anyhow is that the publishing industry is very supportive of LGBTQIA individuals. I don't think historically we've had an issue. I feel the more kind of recent scaremongering has come from within the influx of social media and a political sort of football, or the quote unquote culture wars, basically leveraging, trans, non-binary, and also, gay couples who now want to adopt or are in the firing line. So, these people are moving the goalposts and trying to change a conversation, which I would feel primarily happens online, and it kind of filters. But I will say, on the whole, people have not had an issue. But what I feel boards are wanting to hear, especially, is the legal rights that come with, transitioning. And as Andrew mentioned, supporting staff who might not want to go to a place where it's difficult to be yourself. However, having said that, I think I also want to reiterate that there are also queer people living in those places, and it's a discussion to be had about how confident and comfortable people feel, but also in this country as well, with the laws changing and, particular parties pursuing a particular line that will antagonize especially non-binary and trans people. It's so important to not just think about safety overseas if you're working in sales, but also at home, right here on our own turf. We've got our own kind of battles, or at least we've all got to come together effectively to protect those people who are the most vulnerable. So I will say boards, again, want to look at the legal framework with regards to what actually happens when someone transitions. A lot of the people that work in publishing that aren't part of the community, the queer community, they won't have too much of an insight into what it is to transition or to be queer. So again, those boards need to have, away days with directors and chief executive officers and managing directors and stakeholders who, again, don't understand, because they've never once had an interaction with a queer person in their life, because their lives are so siloed and they might not sort of have had the exposure or the opportunity to meet that. So I think in terms of high level senior leadership teams, there is absolutely an importance to be placed on understanding the workforce. So whether that's 50, 5 or 500 or 5,000, both in the UK and overseas, or, in a small rural village in Staffordshire, it's imperative that you understand your workforce and how you can support them. So Yes, more
Brilliant.
education on the different splinters of the community, but also as a collective, how they can be uplifted to achieve their potential as people who are coming up through the ranks and build their career with the company, which is something we're not seeing much of. Boards are telling me people are leaving to go freelance because there is not the support within a corporate framework, and that needs to be tackled. Otherwise, there is going to be much more of an exodus than what we've already been seeing or what I've been hearing.
And obviously, you're doing this with boards across the UK. But
Mhm.
is there anywhere else people can turn as a SME owner, or to kind of do this not just with their big boards, but like as an independent
Yeah.
publisher?
I absolutely would agree. I think that independent publishers, you might well find that you're part of an Indies Alliance, or you have a particular kind of collective
Yeah,
within which you're kind of formed. However, I will also say that some of the sort of big five publishers have networks which they allow other publishers are all welcome, and they don't just have to be necessarily the big five publishers. So it's all
yeah,
about collaboration and the sharing of resources, especially at a
yes,
time where costs are increasing. And thinking from these board members who are often having to make sort of cuts to budgets, and
yeah,
we're finding that people are being made redundant, but also again making sure that you can best manage a resource when it's often being provided on a gratis basis in order to
yeah,
you understand and create those networks. But essentially, yeah, I
brilliant.
would absolutely say should take advantage of the larger publishers that are able and capable of hosting a larger kind of audience. They are, I
Yeah,
believe, more willing to allow people to come in from all different facets of the publishing world.
fabulous. Thank you so much. Andrew, back to you. What impact have you seen Frog Literary Agency make for the LGBTQ plus community? And I'm sure we'd all love to hear a little bit more about the Frog Literary Agency. It's quite special.
Well, I would love to think it's made a huge impact, but I don't know if
Yes,
that's
that's
actually
what
the
I
case.
heard.
Well, it's still quite small. Unfortunately, it's not my day job. But yeah, basically the whole reason I set it up was because in my previous job I was an editor commissioning like queer writers, and I had a lot of control over that. But then I also think that agents are really vitally important within the whole publishing industry and the journey of a book. And if they're bringing the books to the editors, it's really important that the inclusivity is at the very beginning of that journey. And I was looking at agents and agencies, and I didn't really see, apart from the Good Literary Agency, which I think actually is no longer working, there wasn't really like a specific queer agency. So I felt like, oh, well, maybe this is a gap. Maybe it's worth exploring what comes of this. And yeah, I think I think the main thing that I've seen with it is that there is so much great writing out there that does deserve to be published. I cannot take everyone on, and unfortunately, there's so much I have to turn down, which I do think could actually be taken on. And it just makes me wonder whether there could be clearer signposting for kind of queer writers, or there could be more agencies, more agents who are very specific, like, this is what I'm looking for. I know they are out there. I know they are. I know who they are, and they do exist. And they do that already. But what more could be done around that? Could there be more queer imprints? I just feel like it's the same. When everyone was like, where do I go to? It's just the same imprints and the same publishers. I mentioned again, like, go to Dialogue, go to the Good Literary Agency, go here. It's like, is that it? What else? Why is there not more? Why is it taking so long to get there? And some stories that I've had with people I've taken on, like I took someone on who had an agent, but the agent dropped them because they felt that their book just wasn't going to be commercial enough, and it was like a lesbian romance. And so I took it on, and then we sold it. It just kind of made me think that there's kind of like a level I suppose like queer writers almost have to work a bit harder, right? There's this kind of ceiling that you have to then get over to kind of prove that, yes, this book is really going to be able to be sold to the big kind of publishers. And so you kind of get let go, which I think that's actually quite sad. But I think I do feel like it's been nice to have people come to me and to be suggested, but I just wish there was kind of more out there, I suppose.
Yeah, because it also has sorry to interrupt. I just thought it also has an impact on what we see on the screen. As we know, I'm not sure of the percentage, but the books to screen, if there's more material available, there'll be more visibility on screen of these stories. And
Yeah, I think something I struggled with is I've had some editors say to me that they couldn't take a project on because the author needed to be a household name, and I was like, what queer person is a household name who isn't like Alan Carr and Graham Norton? I was like, that person, they don't really exist. That's making authors having to work extra hard already.
Yeah.
That just feels a bit unfair. But something else I just wanted to add was that, like, something else that I realized is to do with intersectionality as well, because I feel like one issue with diversity is that it can become very easily siloed. And like, obviously, my agency, I'm already siloing, right, by just saying that I'm only for queer writers.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you can't be queer and a person of color, obviously, but, you know, immediately you do create these kind of like factions. And that happens when you have like awards for underrepresented writers, all these kinds of stuff. You start kind of grouping and pigeonholing because that's the only way to kind of start growing. And but then it makes me worry that you lose that kind of intersectionality and the actual real diversity and inclusion because you're just kind of having these little pockets of people. So that was just something I thought I'd mention because it's something I see. Like, I do have a lot of white clients and I'd love to have more people of color, but I feel like there is sometimes a struggle to really be fully diverse and inclusive. But that's just something I've seen.
Maybe something to put in your 5 to 10 year strategy.
Yeah.
Hamza, you wanted to add.
I just want to add to Andrew's point. Actually, I think Andrew makes a really good point about the fact that, you know, that there are editors that will only take on LGBTQIA community members if they've been a household name. However, again, just to add some sort of nuance to that, I actually myself was working as a temp a few years back. Over 5 years ago, I worked at Octopus Publishing Group, and at this publishing company, we had a in-house kind of meeting where people could bring ideas to the table. So this is known as intellectual property or an IP project. So sometimes people can get published without having a literary agent or a person representing them, and for which, when I was at Octopus, I brought Shobana Gulati, who you might know as the actress who recently came out as non-binary, and who's been in Dinner Ladies and Coronation Street, Doctor Who, to name just a few television shows. Just to go back to the point that Andrew made about you know, how easier it is if you're a household name, I would argue that it's not always necessarily the case. I think that publishing has an issue because it feels that we as queer people are a niche. As you said, we're being put into these kind of Polari prizes and certain, you know, initiatives, and we need to fundamentally be embedded into the fabric of the ecosystem in which we operate. If we are not, we are always going to be a minority. We're always going to be viewed as a minority. We're always going to be seen as a minority. Whereas I think what really needs to happen within the publishing industry, and I find this a lot when I speak to boards and higher senior level management, is that the issues that we're finding in publishing is when it comes to selling the book, because there are more than just the writing of the book and having an editor at the stage at which the book needs to be, you know, crafted into a presentable form. It's then after that, it's the marketing, it's the publicity, it's the sales reps and the sales teams, both at home and overseas. We know that some countries are just not okay with buying any literature that's LGBTQIA, you know, adjacent, and that is a fact of the matter. However, what we don't talk about enough is that we have an anti-LGBTI, you know, kind of vehement, a vehemently kind of powerful, kind of meaningful dialogue within this country where it kind of is seen as too niche. I mean, just look at the way that Shuggie Bain, which was a book published by Pan Macmillan, was put into the world. It was a book that had 2 gay men kissing on the front cover. I would imagine that if you were in rural Bedfordshire or Surrey or some parts of, you know, Monmouthshire, that there would be people who would object to the fact that a book has 2 gay men kissing on the front. So the problem is twofold. We've got an issue both in the publishing houses, because the entire ecosystem is created to make us, again, feel as though we're outsiders, but we're not. We're living, breathing taxpayers within this country who deserve to be seen on the stage, on screen, but also within our books. So again, I agree with Andrew. We need to be a bit more savvy as publishers, because we can kind of think about, you know, bottom line profits and profit and loss sheets, and we can try and conjure up through the biblio a way in which you can make money by somebody being queer. But it's not about that. It's about developing a writer. It's not just being, you know, someone who you can throw money at because we're flavor of the month. I think there needs to be a lot more smarter thinking with regards to how we're positioned, not just within the words and the crafting of a book and in the editorial function, but also along the myriad of different departments at which the book will meet in order to reach a wider audience and readership. I think that's crucial to our kind of future as publishing, and in this age of this sadly anti-DEI, anti-diversity, inclusivity, and equitable initiatives. We're seeing a lot more pushback, I would say, because people are following suit, are not kind of engaging with their own critical thinking skills. I think a lot of senior leadership teams would benefit from being brave, for being people who know that they can turn the dial. But also, we call ourselves a risky business when we set up an advance and a publisher is giving an advance payment to a military historian who's writing about the Blitz for the 726th time. We don't call that a risk. But we always find that somebody who is, a non-binary hijab-wearing dragon slayer in a children's book, might be a little bit too much for Kingfisher or Templar books. I find that there's a real there's a sort of dissonance, I would say, within the publishing industry, and I believe we're really paling in comparison to other parts of the world because we're sadly kowtowing to other countries and their ways of thinking, and that will be to our detriment and to the publishing world's detriment, because we're just going to sadly have fewer LGBTQIA plus writers and their stories told in the world, which is what we need more of. We need more enriching of our queer lives, and I'm so proud to be someone who advocates for that, and I think it's necessary for us to do so.
So be bold, be brave, and challenge what you're doing, and go and do it.
Yeah, that's quite right.
Yes. So Hamza, staying with you, people may or may not know that you were one of the founders of Pride in Publishing. What have we seen impact-wise of Pride in Publishing since 2017?
Just to give you some context for those who don't know, Pride in Publishing is a kind of inter-publishing kind of mixing together all the different pieces of our wonderful myriad of corporate, larger publishing houses, academic trade, but also small indies. When I started with a sort of large group of Pride in Publishing co-founders, we initially wanted to set up a place where we can talk about how hard it is for two, same-sex couple individuals who might want to have parental leave because they're adopting or they're fostering, or perhaps they're going to have surrogacy and want to raise a child. And when I mentioned that to people in the industry in 2017, they'd say, "Oh goodness, you really need that? Like you still need to have a discussion." And yes, we did. But I think what Pride in Publishing has made is twofold. On the one hand, we've had a slew of in-house networks, which is great, and I believe people should be part of if they feel comfortable to be out and proud, but some people aren't. But there's a real kind of tightrope to walk, because there might be some people who aren't comfortable, so publishers need to provide a kind of neutral platform, or one where people who might not want to be necessarily immediately identified a chance to breathe and be themselves. But at the same time, I would also say we've had a negative impact since Pride in Publishing started, because we're now seeing antagonizing anti-trans groups and people within publishing are kind of reading into what the media is writing. It's a sort of an obsession of the genitals of an individual, which I find quite concerning, and it is sadly, again, kind of rousing a sort of very negative feeling around the community, and sort of bringing a fear which wasn't once there. So there are two different impacts, I'd say. One that's been positive, we've seen more people sort of celebrated, but on the other hand, we've also seen a rise, I would say, in people kind of wanting to cause issues and make the lives of queer, trans, non-binary people a lot harder for simply existing by wanting to try and police certain aspects about their lives and how they feel, which I think we should actively speak up against if you are able to do so.
Thank you so much. I'm just checking to see if there's any burning questions coming through from the audience. It's your reminder to ask now. We've got one last question to go. Joe Bottrell, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. Just going back to where else can independents go to look to. Of course, our friends at the IPG, the Independent Publishers Guild, have a brilliant DE&I group. So if you are an independent publisher and not yet a member of IPG, sign up. It's a fabulous community, and they have a DEI group that you should be part of and join in that conversation and listen and learn and grow. So thank you, Joe, for reminding us of that. And a big shout out to IPG. So coming to the last question here, we have I'm just trying to find my banner. So Pride Month is not just for June, as we've clearly stated in our conversations today. And so the question is, what is the one call to action for the audience to do every day or every week for the rest of the year that would make the biggest impact in together us cultivating a more inclusive culture for all of our colleagues and friends in the LGBTQ+ community? So Andrew, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, I kind of already said one of them, which was just kind of standing up for people. If any friends or family or work colleagues, anyone says anything that you feel maybe isn't quite right. I mean, you can be curious, you can engage them with that conversation. Why are they saying that? A lot of the time people say it because they don't even realize. So it doesn't need to be confrontational. But I actually think one is, and we're in the business of books. I actually think just reading books written by queer people is really important. I think books are a great way of instilling empathy in you, and you can understand someone else's life experience through reading fiction and non-fiction. I think that's really vitally important, and then you'll kind of have a much clearer understanding of what we're going through. And then I suppose alongside that, it's just a constant sort of educating yourself, being curious, why are people annoyed about this particular issue, or what does this particular kind of ruling mean for people in the community. I think that's really important, and being well informed so that when those kinds of conversations come up, you can kind of contribute to them meaningfully. I think that's important.
So I love what you say about, calling it out and sort of flagging it up. And certainly I think, just to add to that, like actually having a way of doing that is a really sensible way forward as well. So whether it's like, a certain coloured flag, like purple flag, that's the word. It's not aggressive. It's just like purple flag. That's not okay to say. It's like an acceptable, so that people know how to challenge it as well. So that could be something interesting that we could bring into our workplaces, where it's non-aggressive, but a way of somebody saying, "Oh, I don't think what you've said there is quite right." Or, as you say, like away from the meeting, just pull them aside gently.
Yeah. Can I just
Hamza,
quickly?
Yeah.
I just want to jump in on that, because actually I would also say it's quite hard sometimes, and I've had my own experience when I first started out in the industry as a junior kind of editorial assistant, publishing assistant about 10 years ago. I had somebody in an interview, or at least after an interview, upon, returning some feedback about why I was unsuccessful, and it was something along the lines of I was sort of too flamboyant, or kind of too much. And that's always stuck with me, actually. And I think that was because this person was kind of, I feel, from a different generation where people were quite brazenly and openly homophobic. It kind of hurt at the time, and obviously I couldn't sort of reply back and say that was not acceptable. But I think if candidates as well, so I'm talking here specifically about people, and you're working for a recruitment agency, there are people within, this ecosystem that aren't actually in-house yet, but are on the cusp of being paid. It's a sort of red flag, really, if you are to get kind of feedback, but also for recruitment agencies like yourself, Susie, and your wonderful team, to know that any feedback that is communicated to members or candidates who you might feel is homophobic or using inflammatory language is something that you can raise up, because of course it's not just in-house, it's also people that are the third-party people who are connecting, people wanting to work in our wonderful industry with the wonderful publishers. But sometimes it's not wonderful when you're kind of, commented on, and your kind of existence is kind of a reason for you not getting a job, which I feel is actually a breach of Equalities Law, the Law Act of 2010. So I really do think people should take, homophobic.
Absolutely. And just to kind of just to reassure anyone watching today, so Inspired will not work with any organisation that is deemed to be discriminatory on any levels. So, if there's any sense of that at all, ageism, racism, homophobic, whatever it is, we would just not work with them. And certainly if we see any of that kind of behaviour, we definitely would flag up, because we want to place people in jobs where they will thrive and it's safe, because it's your careers that we're managing. So thank you for flagging that, though. It's great. But did you have any other ideas as well, just in terms of what we could do?
One thing I will say is I find a lot of people in senior leadership teams, but also boards, they don't quite know where to start, because there's just a huge overwhelming feeling of too much is changing too fast. And you might have a DEI person within your publishing company that you've just employed, but they might not be able to cover all facets of what diversity, inclusivity, and inclusion means. So I would just say, be brave and be able to factor in that you might need an external consultant. And that's where my company, my presence as, the founder and CEO of Hamza Jahanzeb.co.uk comes in. I think it's really important to be able to bring someone outside of the organization to come in and review something as an independent consultant, as often there are things that can be easily remedied, but you just need, an outside pair of eyes, or somebody with the kind of whose duty it is to make sure that your company's organization and structure is working in a way that caters to, people that are coming out not just as LGBTQIA, but also people who are disabled, people who are neurodivergent. What about accessibility? These things are all simultaneously linked, because a lot of people are facing issues because of, newly diagnosed neurological disabilities, and it's often noted that there is a lack of diagnosis in women, for example, for neurodiversity and ADHD or autism, because the societies kind of believe that this is just kind of quote unquote normal, whatever that might mean. So my call to action is to make sure people in sort of mid-level managerial roles to have a conversation with their senior leadership teams to make sure that if they do feel that there is an issue that might need somebody external to really think about how, someone who's a DEI specialist or an EDI specialist, these are equality, diversity, inclusion acronyms for those not familiar, but again, just to make sure that their place of work is kind of having these kind of not checks, but like a self-assessment, from time to time, how well are we doing? Is there a reason why we've had an influx of people leaving, and the HR teams within these publishing companies are saying that actually I left because I wasn't safe at work. I was being harassed online, or my agent and my publisher just sadly didn't kind of stand up for me. And I think there is a real willingness to learn, and I feel that there are so many people I've met who just need a kind of a conversation, because all that they've been reading have been in the UK kind of legacy press, and often it's kind of targeting and portraying people such as sensitivity readers, of which I am too, as pitchfork wielding, devil incarnates who basically want to change the course of history. I don't press the button before your book gets printed in Italy or China or at Clay's in the UK. I wish I did, and it's so kind of affirming to know that there are people talking so grandiose about the work you do, but it's actually not anywhere near the truth. And I've written for the Society of Authors, the Author magazine, about that. So my call to action, again, to CEOs, to senior leadership teams, is just to have a conversation, maybe have an initial call, sometimes check in, because things have changed since you were last employed. A lot of senior leadership team managers or people at the very executive board of a company often haven't hired themselves for years, sometimes over a decade. So they're not in touch. My call to action is to CEOs: don't be out of touch. Be woke. Be awakened to social injustices. Be awakened to the market changing. Be awakened to the fact that your company is seeing a mass exodus because of X, Y, and Z, and people are going freelance. Why are people leaving a company? Why are you not retaining those staff members? Why aren't you promoting those staff members? This is imperative for real future leaders. And I do think, again, I have to give credit where it's due to companies like Hachette and Bonnier. Bonnier have their parental leave. It was introduced a few years ago, 6 months, and it doesn't matter if you're the primary carer or the secondary carer. It doesn't matter what gender you are able to have 6 months of paid parental leave. That is fantastic. What we need now is to really consider all options. And if there has been an incident, how can we kind of troubleshoot that so it doesn't happen again? We don't want this company to be known as one where, perhaps, women or men or people who are, gender non-conforming are not safe and don't feel that we'll, support them in their career development. And in essence, they're a real asset to the business because they've made a lot of corporate, profit. I mean, companies are interested in that. I'm not going to get away from that. But also, why aren't we giving those people? It's the best interest of the business, the corporate, CEOs and MDs to retain the staff, but also to make sure there's a balance, between making sure you can achieve your goals as per what the business's needs, but also making sure that your workforce who are working for you are contented and also feel that they can work their best in your place of work.
Perfect. Well, I think the time is up for us today, but what an incredible event today has been. A big thank you to both Andrew and Hamza for all your incredible insight. I think there's lots of practical tips that we can take away. We'll certainly be putting those down into a blog and sharing that with our network. So watch this space. But I think really just to kind of close today, Pride is not just for June. It's for all year round. You've got lots of inspiration coming from this event on how you can make change and impact. And finally, just that you matter, your story matters, and you are the ones that can make our workplaces and our worlds better. So thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you soon. Cheers, guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.